Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a really fundamental question today. Why is it that, faced with similar kinds of stress, some people stay calm, resilient even, while others?
Well, they seem to escalate really quickly towards aggression, sometimes extreme violence.
Yeah, it's a profound difference.
And we're going beyond just like personality quirks here. We want to explore the actual biosocial blueprint of violence.
Exactly. It's incredibly complex. Our deep dive today, it's based on a really thorough literature survey that pulls together research from genetics, neurobiology, psychology, the environment, all of it.
So the mission is to kind of distill all that down. Give us the full picture.
That's the goal. We want to understand what drives these really dramatic individual differences in violent behavior.
Because it's clear high aggression is never just one thing.
Never. It's always an interaction. So today, we'll map out that whole journey, from possible genetic predispositions, how the brain's wired, and then crucially, how things like early life trauma can sort of activate these vulnerabilities. Okay, so let's start right at the base layer, our DNA. When scientists talk about heritability, like how much of the difference in aggression levels can actually be chalked up to genetics?
Well, the numbers are pretty striking. Heritability estimates suggest that roughly 50 to 65% of the variation we see in high aggression might be linked to genetic factors.
Wow, that's more than half.
It is. But, and this is really crucial, it's not destiny. It's a susceptibility. Think of it like genes might load the gun, but it's usually the environment that pulls the trigger.
Got it. So when we talk about genetic susceptibility, that MAOA gene always seems to pop up. The warrior gene,
Oh,
right? What's the actual deal with that?
yes, the monoamide oxidase, A gene, MAOA. It basically gives instructions for making an enzyme. And this enzyme is like a tiny traffic cop for really important mood chemicals in the brain, neurotransmitters like serotonin, dopamine.
Okay.
Now, there's a specific version, a variant called MAOAL, the low activity one. It
Mhm.
seems to mean less regulation of those chemicals. And that version is linked to increased violence.
But it's not the whole story, is it? I remember the sources mentioned it's rarely just MAOA on its own.
Oh, absolutely not. It's much more complex. For example, there was a big study looked at violent offenders in Finland, and they found that the individuals who committed the most extreme acts often had either that MAOAL variant or a specific variant of another gene called CDH13.
CDH13, what's that one involved in?
CDH13 is interesting. It's linked to cell adhesion, uh, brain development, and that particular variant is strongly associated with problems controlling impulses and also with substance abuse issues. So you see, it's often a combination of genetic risks.
Okay, so multiple genes contributing to susceptibility. Now, what about the brain's structure, the actual hardware? You mentioned impulse control. Which part of the brain is supposed to, put the brakes on an emotional reaction?
That's primarily the job of the prefrontal cortex, the PFC,
Yeah.
especially regions like the orbitofrontal and ventromedial PFC. These areas handle judgment, decision-making, social appropriateness.
The brain's CEO, basically.
Kind of, yeah. And what researchers consistently find in studies of violent individuals is reduced gray matter volume in these specific PFC areas. Less hardware, essentially.
So if the CEO is impaired?
Then judgment is poor,
Mm.
and it's much harder to regulate those strong impulses or complex emotions.
And this connects to the amygdala too, right? The brain's sort of threat detector.
Directly. The amygdala is often hyperreactive in these individuals, so the emotional alarm bells, the threat signals, they're ringing really loudly in response to perceived provocation.
Okay, high alert.
But here's the critical part. There's often reduced connectivity between that hyperreactive amygdala and the PFC, the control center.
Ah.
So the emotional go signal is strong, that bottom-up drive is powerful, but the top-down control from the PFC needed to say, hang on, let's think about this, is weak or slow. The whole system is kind of biased towards reaction, not reflection.
All right, so we've got potentially faulty hardware, this hyperreactive amygdala not communicating well with an underpowered PFC. What about the chemicals running through the system? Let's shift to that chemical cockpit. How do neurotransmitters and hormones play into this?
Well, one of the most consistent findings, really robust, is serotonin dysfunction.
Serotonin, usually associated with mood, right?
Yes, and crucially, it normally acts as an inhibitor, a brake system in the brain. So low serotonin activity is specifically linked to impulsive aggression, the inability to stop that immediate reactive outburst.
Makes sense if the brake is weak.
Exactly. And when that serotonin brake is weak, other systems, like the dopamine system, which is more about reward and motivation, can become hyperactive, further contributing to that impulsive, disinhibited behavior.
And then there's the hormone everyone points to, testosterone. Often gets blamed for aggression, right?
It does, but the research paints a more nuanced picture. Testosterone seems to primarily drive status-seeking behavior, dominance, competition. Not necessarily just random violence.
Mm.
But here's a real wow fact from the research, something called the dual hormone hypothesis.
Yule hormone.
Yeah, it suggests the greatest risk for antisocial and violent behavior actually occurs when you have high testosterone combined with low cortisol.
Low cortisol. That's the stress hormone, isn't it? Why would low stress be linked to violence? That seems counterintuitive.
It does at first glance.
Yeah.
But cortisol is also linked to fear, anxiety, sensitivity to punishment. So the idea is cortisol might act as a sort of brake on testosterone's status-seeking drive.
Ah, okay.
So if you have a really strong drive for dominance, high T, but you don't have that internal caution or anxiety signal, that low cortisol, you might be much more likely to use aggressive, even extreme means to achieve status without that fear of consequences holding you back.
That really complicates the picture. High drive, low fear. Okay. Now let's bring in the environment. This is where the gene-environment interaction, or GXE, comes in, right? Activating these biological vulnerabilities.
This is absolutely critical. This is where it all comes together. We see violence emerging from these powerful synergistic combinations. Remember the MAOAL gene we talked about?
Yeah, the low activity version.
The research clearly shows that individuals who carry that MAOAL variant and also experience significant childhood maltreatment abuse, neglect, they show a markedly higher risk of developing violent behavior later on.
So the gene creates the sensitivity, but the trauma flicks the switch.
Precisely. But it might be even more complex than just risk. This leads to the idea of differential susceptibility.
Differential susceptibility, meaning?
It suggests these so-called risk genes might actually just make people more sensitive to their environment in general. So yes, they might have worse outcomes in a bad, stressful environment,
Okay.
but potentially they could have better outcomes than average in a really supportive, positive environment. Their biology makes them more responsive, for better or worse.
Wow. So genetic sensitivity isn't just a negative thing. It depends on the context.
Exactly. It could be a vulnerability, or it could amplify positive influences. And this environmental programming, the sources point out, it's not just psychological. It gets physically embedded through epigenetics.
Epigenetics, like changing how genes are read.
That's right. Things like severe early life stress or abuse can cause epigenetic changes, like DNA methylation on genes involved in the stress response system, for example, the serotonin transporter gene. The environment literally leaves a biological mark that can alter how these systems function long term.
So the trauma essentially programs a lasting biological vulnerability, decades later even.
It can, yes. It's a stark demonstration of how deeply our early environment shapes our biology.
Okay, so moving from that embedded biology to the broader context, childhood adversity keeps coming up as a huge predictor. The literature survey was really clear. Physical and sexual abuse seem to have the strongest link to later aggression, persisting right into adulthood.
Yes, trauma has profound effects. It doesn't just leave emotional scars. It fundamentally changes how a person perceives and interacts with the world. It can severely impair their ability to regulate emotions.
And it changes how they see others' intentions.
Exactly. It often creates what psychologists call hostile attribution biases. This means they're much more likely to interpret neutral or ambiguous social cues, someone bumping into them accidentally, or an odd look, as intentionally hostile or threatening.
Which sounds like a recipe for constant conflict.
It is. It primes them for that quick, defensive, reactive aggression because they're perceiving threats where none might exist.
And we also need to consider the structural factors like poverty. The research mentioned that cumulative poverty, especially in early adulthood, predicts criminal violence. How does that fit in?
Poverty acts as a concentrator of stressors. It's not just about lacking money. It often means less stability, more exposure to violence, fewer safe spaces, weaker community support networks, and crucially, less access to resources that build resilience. Things like good schools, stable jobs, quality mental health care.
So it just stacks the deck against vulnerable individuals.
It absolutely does. These structural factors create an environment where aggression might feel like a necessary survival tool, or where the buffers against it are just worn away.
And speaking of things that wear away buffers, substance abuse, particularly alcohol, the data you mentioned was pretty stark.
Yeah, alcohol consistently shows the strongest link to violence among all substances. The statistics are sobering. No pun intended. Research suggests alcohol is involved in something like 32% of murders in the U.S.
Wow.
And a huge percentage, maybe 40 to 60%, of domestic violence incidents involve alcohol or drugs.
Why is alcohol so strongly linked? What's the mechanism?
It's a direct hit on the brain's control systems. Alcohol impairs executive functions, judgment, planning, foresight. It lowers impulse control dramatically, and it can distort threat perception. So it essentially dissolves whatever regulatory capacity a person might have had, making impulsive aggression much more likely.
Okay. And finally, within this context, what about specific psychological profiles? Psychopathy comes up constantly as a strong predictor.
It does. Psychopathy, characterized by callousness, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, it's a major risk factor. But it's important to distinguish the types of violence it predicts.
Types.
Yeah. Psychopathy isn't monolithic. There's the affective interpersonal dimension, that core lack of remorse, the superficial charm, the manipulation. This part is more strongly linked to instrumental planned violence.
Like violence used as a tool, cold and calculated.
Exactly. Goal-oriented violence to get something: money, status, control. Then there's the antisocial behavioral dimension, the impulsivity, the irresponsibility, the chronic antisocial behavior. This part is more predictive of the impulsive reactive aggression, the sudden flare-ups.
Got it. Two different styles of aggression linked to different facets of psychopathy.
Right. And underlying both, often, is that executive dysfunction we talked about earlier. Deficits in things like working memory, mental flexibility, and especially inhibitory control, the ability to stop an action once it's started. This impulsivity seems to be a key mediator between psychopathy and actual violent acts, particularly the reactive kind.
So we've built this really complex picture. Biological predispositions, chemical imbalances, environmental triggers, psychological factors. Given all of that, what can actually be done? What tools do we have to intervene and maybe change that trajectory towards violence?
Well, the good news is interventions can work. The approach with the strongest evidence base, especially for reducing reoffending, is cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT.
CBT. We hear about that for anxiety, depression. It works for aggression, too.
It does. Multiple large-scale reviews, meta-analyses, show that CBT can reduce recidivism, that's the rate of reoffending, by around 25% among criminal offenders, which is a significant impact, especially for high-risk individuals.
Okay, 25%. What does aggression-focused CBT actually involve? What are they teaching?
It typically focuses on a few key areas. One is anger management, obviously learning to recognize triggers and deploy coping skills. Another is cognitive restructuring. That means identifying and challenging those hostile attribution biases we discussed, learning to reinterpret situations more realistically.
So retraining the thought patterns.
Exactly. And a third component is often social problem-solving skills. Basically, teaching constructive ways to handle conflict and achieve goals without resorting to aggression. It's about building the self-regulation skills that might be lacking biologically or weren't learned due to trauma.
And can medications help? You mentioned neurotransmitter imbalances like low serotonin acting as a weak brake. Can we use meds to boost that?
Yes, pharmacology can definitely play a role.
Mm-hmm.
Medications that enhance serotonin activity, commonly known as SSRIs, the antidepressants, have shown effectiveness in reducing impulsive aggression in some individuals. They essentially help strengthen that inhibitory brake. Other medications, like certain atypical antipsychotics or mood stabilizers such as lithium, can also reduce aggression, often used when there are co-occurring conditions like bipolar disorder or psychosis.
So it really sounds like it needs to be a combined approach, not just one thing.
Absolutely. The most effective strategies are usually multimodal. They integrate therapy, skills training, perhaps medication, family support, if possible, addressing the issue from multiple angles.
Right.
But if you look at all the research, the area with the greatest potential for actually preventing violence in the long run is early intervention.
Getting in there before these patterns become entrenched.
Precisely. Research shows that aggressive behaviors actually peak developmentally before age 2.
That early. Wow.
Yes. So intervening early with programs that support at-risk families, things like parent training, home visits, developmental support for kids, and also school-based programs that explicitly teach social emotional skills, empathy, impulse control. That offers the best hope for disrupting this trajectory before it leads to chronic problems. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, this has been a really comprehensive deep dive. It's clear that understanding aggression means looking at this intricate web of factors. Let's try and boil it down to the biggest takeaways for everyone listening.
Yeah, 3 main points stand out. First, violence isn't caused by one single thing. It's always a dynamic interaction. The key model is genes might set the stage for sensitivity, but it's the environment that really shapes whether that sensitivity leads to vulnerability or even potentially to strength. That GXE interaction is paramount.
Right. Genes load the gun, environment pulls the trigger, or maybe even helps put the safety on sometimes. Second takeaway.
Second, the neurobiology provides clear mechanisms. We see this combination of deficient impulse control linked to things like reduced PFC volume or function and low serotonin activity combined with limbic hyperactivity, especially that overreactive amygdala. That pairing creates a real vulnerability to reacting aggressively under stress.
The weak brakes and a hyperactive engine. Got it. And third,
Third, and this is the hopeful part, interventions work. We have evidence-based tools like CBT that can significantly reduce violent reoffending. They work by teaching and reinforcing the cognitive and behavioral self-regulation skills that might be underdeveloped due to biology or environment.
so the big picture implication here seems to be that if we really want to tackle violence on a societal level, we can't just react to it after it happens. We need to look upstream.
Exactly. It means focusing on things like reducing poverty, ensuring access to high-quality early childhood education and support, providing comprehensive mental health care, addressing the root environmental factors that interact with biology, not just managing the symptoms.
Which leads us to a final thought, maybe a challenging question for everyone listening. Given what we've learned about differential susceptibility, how supportive environments can buffer, maybe even positively leverage genetic risks, what responsibility does society actually have?
Right. What's our collective responsibility to try and ensure that every child, regardless of, say, their MAOA genotype or their family background, gets access to that kind of gold standard supportive environment that allows
Yeah.
them to thrive, not just survive?